Do you think you really know your spouse? Do you know if he or she is happy? Do you think you can spot if he or she is lying? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then you might be interested in the following interview with renowned deception researcher Professor Steve McCornack. But be warned, as with many interviews on this channel, we are challenging your assumptions, and as a result you may want to let go of some of your most dearly held beliefs. If you can live with that, you're in for a treat. But before we get ahead of ourselves, consider this. It is a well-established fact in social science that people often want the greatest outcome with the least effort, and that is especially true in regards to cognitive effort. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective too, since cognitive attention, after time, is our second most precious commodity in life. If, in evolutionary terms, useful behavior patterns were performed frequently, they became easier and easier to perform, and over time they became mental shortcuts. There's a physical, neuroscientific explanation for this fact, but that's a discussion for another day. Instead, what interests us today is the degree to which we operate on these mental shortcuts, because empirical evidence tells us that we make most decisions based on simple, pre-programmed decision rules which operate completely outside of our conscious awareness. But what has all of this to do with deception and intimate relationships? Well, one of these heuristics, one of these mental shortcuts that I have been talking about, is called the truth bias, and it was Stephen, following his discovery, who coined that name. Truth bias simply means that each time we hear a message from someone else or from the media, we don't interpret this message neutrally. Instead, more often than not, we interpret it as true. There's an evolutionary adaptive logic to the idea that incoming sensory input through ears, eyes, nose, tongue, and body is valid unless demonstrated otherwise, which makes this cognitive bias exceptionally potent and effective. Having inherited an evolutionary adaptation that prevents us from recognizing the truth, even if deception stares us directly into the face, explains our poor performance when it comes to deception detection. In case you don't know it yet, your chances of spotting a lie is about the same as flipping a coin, no matter how sophisticated you think you are, and that's true for laypeople and most professionals from law enforcement. When it comes to intimate relationships, it gets even more complicated. Most of us believe that the cornerstone of an intimate relationship is to understand the partner's thoughts and feelings, and that we know what's going on in each other's heads. But this belief is an illusion. Research clearly shows that we don't know what's going on in each other's heads because of the overwhelming tendency to project our own views onto others. We don't know what's going on in other people's minds, we only think we do. Add to this the fact that the longer we are together with somebody, the better we believe we know that person, and you understand why spouses think that they know each other and why they think that they believe and feel the same things. Still not convinced? There is a way for you to find out how well you know your own spouse, but that's only for the courageous ones amongst us. Scientists studied romantic couples and questioned them on 10 key issues of conflict in relationships. The participants recorded their own feelings about each issue, they recorded what they thought their partner thought about each issue, and they rated how happy they are in their relationship. You can do exactly the same. If you stick around, after the interview, you and your spouse can do this test for yourselves, if you so desire. I will provide you with the 10 questions and explain how to use them. And in case you wonder which couples were the happiest ones, also this will be revealed after the interview. For now, let's just say that the happiest couples were not the ones that were most accurate about each other's thoughts and feelings in the test. And now enjoy the interview. And here we go. Stephen McCornack. Do I pronounce your name at least correctly?
Yeah, that's pretty close. I will respond to pretty much anything from McCormick to, McNack. I've heard it all. So, but it is in fact McCornack. So yes.
Yeah. And I see it's either Steve or Stephen. Tell me, what's the story?
Steve is fine.
Steve is
fine. I'm Stephen to my mother. That's about it.
Okay. Meanwhile, coming from your mother to your professional life, you're professor at the University of Alabama, right?
Correct. University of Alabama, Birmingham. So
Birmingham.
We're not the Roll Tide school. We're the Blazers. So.
Okay. How long are you in this profession?
So meaning as a professor?
Yeah.
I started in the fall of 1988 at Michigan State University.
Okay. Would it be true and truthful to say that you're one of the world's foremost deception detection researchers?
No, I don't think that would be fair to say. There's pretty strong lines drawn in the field between those who study detection and those who study production. And over the years, really for the past, good Lord, now I'm really dating myself, at least 2.5 decades, I've been squarely on the production side. I started out on the detection side, but somewhat quickly lost interest in that and returned to what really were my graduate study roots, which was discourse and language, and that led me in a production direction. There are many people who are, I don't think my name would come up much in detection circles these days.
Okay, so briefly outline, if you will, the difference between production and detection.
So there's obviously strong connection between the two. One can't discuss how we go about detecting lies or detecting deception without thinking about what are the underlying cognitive factors that lead to producing them in the first place. And yet, much of the detection field, and I will circle back to your question, much of the detection field doesn't pay much attention to production issues. So detection is largely occupied with the very obvious and practical concern of how can we tell if somebody is deceiving us. And historically, as I know you know, the focus has largely been on behavioral cues. What behavioral cues do liars consistently admit that truth tellers don't? And so that's where all of the kind of money and research focus internationally largely lies. I would say I don't think it's an overstatement to say that probably 98% of deception scholarship is interested in how can we tell when people are deceiving. My interest is different. My interest is on the production side. And so production is distinct because what we're talking about is going inside the brain and trying to figure out the underlying cognitive mechanics for how and why people play with information in the ways that they do during speech production so as to mislead other people. So that's really where my passion lies and has lied for the last, as I said, probably 25 years now.
Okay, and you just mentioned money, which is a perfect segue into a topic I would like you to outline.
Sure.
The deception detection industry. Yeah, you were kind enough to have an email exchange with me where you outlined certain challenges in that respect. So feel free to elaborate.
So to understand what's going on in the scientific research field of detection, one first must understand their very powerful real-world concerns that relate to this. Everything from terrorist interrogation to judging politicians, etc., law enforcement concerns and armed forces concerns in the United States. So correspondingly, there's huge grant money available if somebody can develop the magic pill, if you will, that will enable us all to discern truth tellers from liars, quote unquote. And so ever since Paul Ekman back in the 1960s, who was really I consider in a lot of ways the founder of detection research, in the sense he was one of the first major scholars who started publishing work looking at detection. Ever since he first started doing his work, funders, largely in the form of law enforcement and DOJ, Department of Justice here in the U.S., but also armed forces military, have been quite willing to pour millions of dollars into funding research to try and help them better detect deception. And so it's hard to separate those two out because that is the scholarship on detection versus the big money at stake in trying to find how we can better, quote unquote, detect liars, because the research inevitably has been funded. When the research is funded, you are expected, immediately neutrality, I think, is somewhat questionable. That is, neutrality for the researchers is somewhat called into question. We like to believe that we're scientists who are immune to outside forces and judging our own data. But if I've been just handed a $10 million 3-year grant to try and discern the cues, that the behavioral indicators that distinguish liars from truth tellers, now there's an agenda set. And I really can't go back to my funders after I've spent the 10 mil and say, well, you know what? You really can't tell the different, liars from truth tellers behaviorally. So, I think anybody who says different, like these financial forces don't play an influential role in how people interpret the results and what people choose to deceive and how they conceive of deception, is somewhat ironically being a bit disingenuous.
Is it not so that even to get those grants, right, you already have to be mindful in which direction you interpret your research, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I can give you a very concrete example of how this plays out, because was party to this in the 90s and early 2000s, when I was still thought of largely as a detection researcher, because I started out in deception detection work in the 1980s and 90s, and then transitioned out. So I'll never forget, I was at Michigan State University, and this was actually early 2000s, because it was shortly after 9/11. I get a phone call one day in my office, and the person on the other end identifies themselves as a government official for a government agency that should remain unspecified. Now, immediately I said, oh, so you mean CIA or NSA? And the person responds, I'm not at liberty to identify this specific agency involved. And what they wanted then, and this is classic kind of, United States federal government stuff. They said, we are currently talking about, in the developmental stages of considering funding a dedicated institute to deception detection and language. And we have a proposal we would like you to review. That's going to guide the formation of this institute. Would you be able to do that? And I said, sure, I'm happy to give it a look and give you some feedback. And they said, okay, well, we need a 12 to 24 hour turnaround. I'm like, well, let me just drop my, teaching and my own research and everything and do my family life for a day. But they said, and so sure enough, what they do is they express mail this thing out. So the next morning I get this big packet that I then have to teleconference with them the following morning. And in the packet is this proposal for this institute. Well, this institute is based upon Paul Ekman's research at the time, which is this idea that there are these microfacial expressions that normal, quote unquote, people can't discern. They're like these secret magical cues that liars emit that only if you're super well trained will you ever be able to discern these things, right? And so the whole institute is predicated on this argument that I and Tim Levine and others who've been doing this, related work know is simply invalid. And so I go through this, and very quickly, it's a blind review, but very quickly I know the proposal is at least, using Ekman's model, which by that time had been used by the FBI and others to try and detect deception. This cue-based model that says, here are the things you want to look at that liars do that truth tellers don't. So long story short, I spend the night, going through this teleconference with these folks the next morning. And they said, what's your honest appraisal of this? And I said, well, here are the problems with it. And I went through the research with them, which very clearly, all of the meta-analytic research. And for your listeners or viewers who might not be familiar with what means meta-analytic, a meta-analysis is the gold standard for research. Because what a meta-analysis does is take all of the existing research in a particular domain and it analyzes all of those data in one vat at one time. So any particular study will find different things, but a meta-analysis will tell you the truth about broad domains. And all of the meta-analytic data we have suggests that that there are no cues that consistently distinguish truth tellers from liars across time and people and situations. And so this is what I told them. And so they said, well, what's your bottom line in terms of whether you would support funding this? And I said, honestly, I think that it would be wasted money. I don't think you should fund this. Now, as this conversation's evolving, I'm getting this very strong feeling that this is all a fait accompli, because they're giving me these one-word answers like, okay, yeah. And I'm just thinking, I'm just knowing that they've already made the decision to fund this, because this is in the wake of 9/11. So they really want to find out, whether, interrogated suspects, terrorist suspects are lying to them or not. And so sure enough, we get to the end of it and they're like, thank you very much. And that was it. And then, a few months later, I find out that they poured all the money into it. So, so the whole reasoning being what I talked about in my 1997 book chapter, which I think I sent to you, which is there are these dominant hopeful myths about deception and detection. And they're myths in that they're simply not true. Things like it's harder to lie than tell the truth, and there are cues associated with lying, but they're hopeful, meaning we really, really want to believe them. And there was a time when I really wanted to believe them too. So they're very appealing and intuitive and false.
Yeah, you scratched on a lot of topics that I would like to discuss.
Sure.
There are, of course, the stereotypical deception cues, right? We're going to dive into this. Before we do, there is the element of the academic research and academic funding, but there is a whole popular industry in the background which also earns, I think, billions on the back of non-verbal communication applied as deception tools. And I always put a qualifier in here. I do not disqualify non-verbal communication as a whole, but I disqualify it as deception detection tool, because as you said, there is ample research the last 50 years or longer even, where it's clear that there are no universal deception cues which work all the time by all people in all circumstances. Okay?
So let me just interject something about this, because this is important, again, for people who are listening to this. I'm not such a zealot that I'm going to say there are no individual tells, to use a poker term, that somebody might have. So if somebody comes to me and says, well, my partner always scratches his nose whenever he lies. Okay, I'm not going to say you're wrong. But what I will say is to identify that as a valid cue, you need two forms of evidence. First, they always perform that same behavior every time they lie. Second, which is actually the one that many people don't think of, they never perform that behavior when they tell the truth. Otherwise, it's simply not a reliable indicator. Then if you broaden that out to, as I said pretty quickly a few moments ago, across people, that cue then has to hold up across everyone, not 80%, not 90%, or else it's not a reliable cue. It's got to be 100% of people always scratch their nose whenever they lie. And then that has to hold up across those people across time. It can't be just this week. It's got to be across this next year. And situations. It can't be just when talking to a lover. It needs to be when being interrogated by police or whatever, across different contexts. And that's the standard we need to abide by if we're going to start claiming that certain cues hold. And that's what we mean when Tim Levine and I look at the meta-analytic data and we say, there are no cues that rise to that standard.
Tim Levine, as you know, I interviewed him not so long ago. You and a number of other well-versed and well-experienced researchers all say the same thing. Yeah. Nevertheless, there are stereotypical deception cues, and I always use this one research team as an example. It's called the Global Deception Research Team. They did research in 75 countries. I'm pretty sure you're aware. And they found that basically pan-cultural and globally, there are certain stereotypical deception cues where the broad population and professionals believe, for example, and that's the number one, if I cannot look you into your eyes, that you are lying. Yeah.
This one goes back to Aristotle. You see somebody's soul in their eyes. I think it was Aristotle. And it's I think to understand that one, if we focus on that just for a moment, you have to understand the incredible power of eye contact, and not just eye contact, but rather shared gaze. So if we establish sustained gaze between the two of us for any period of time, that actually is the root basis for triggering a sense of empathy in the human brain. So when we look at infant development, what we see is the empathy centers of the brain become patched and interconnected through sharing gaze with caregivers. And this is a really important thing that my colleague, Dr. Kelly Morrison, and I talk about a lot when we team teach our classes and we're talking about child development of things like empathy, is you need to spend a lot of time with your infant children just staring into their eyes. And babies, once they're past about 2 weeks, will do that. They'll just lock onto your gaze and they'll just stare at you for minutes on end. And what's actually happening when they do that is all the parts of the brain that are kind of nascent empathy centers are starting to connect. All those neurons are starting to patch together. And then we see this, of course, within online text-based media. If I can't see you, it's very difficult for me to empathize with you. And that's one of the reasons why people are so hateful via modalities like Twitter and posting online when it's purely text-based. If I can't see you, it's difficult for me to empathize, so I'm going to say incredibly hateful things that quite literally I would never say to your face. So if you've ever had that feeling of, oh, well, would you say that to my face? The answer is probably no if somebody just sent you a nasty message. Now bring that to the realm of deception. There's a reason why people think eye contact is such a powerful indicator of deception, because its roots in empathy. If you're looking right in my eye, I feel like I'm connected to you emotionally. I feel like I can see inside your soul. So you're not capable of hiding anything from me at that moment. But what we do know is, from the research, as you cited, is that, in fact, there's no correlation. And no correlation doesn't mean negative correlation. No correlation means sometimes truth tellers look you in the eye and sometimes they don't. Sometimes liars look you in the eye and sometimes they don't. There's just no relationship there. What I always ask my students when I talk about this is, other than getting your story straight, if you're going to lie to somebody though, what's the first behavioral cue you think of? And what's the most easily controllable thing? And what they always say is eye contact. And then I say, so what do you look for when you think somebody is lying to you? And what they almost always say is, oh, well, I see if they can look me in the eye. And I'm like, why would you do that? It doesn't even pass the intuition test. So, yeah.
Also, this stereotype is so well known, that a experienced liar, they are doing on purpose the opposite, because they know you think, you look away and you lie. But the eyes are not the only one. There are a number of others. Any signs of nervousness is very often interpreted as lying. Self-touches, speech interruptions, etc., etc. Where we know from scientific evidence they're not related to deception, right? So coming back to the original question, there is a huge industry out there, and many of those books you see behind me, like Spot the Lie and Learn How to Detect a Lie in 30 days, all these kind of things. But interestingly, I also studied interview techniques, right? And even some research paper where you find stereotypical deception cues mentioned, where we know from ample evidence it's simply not true. And this brings me back to, how come that the general population have so consistently, pan-culturally and globally, such a incorrect perception of when it comes to deception detection, right?
Well, I think, let me respond in a number of ways. First, I think the root goes back once again to the idea of hopeful myths. People really, really want to feel like they can tell when important others are lying to them. And this is a human universal, right? I mean, and it goes back millennia. It's one of the great, I would say, if you take it to a more philosophical level, one of the great human quandaries we all experience is the isolation of our existence. We never really are in another human being's head. From the moment we're born to the moment we die, we live a subjective existence. And so the best we can ever do is kind of create a feeling or a sense that we're in somebody else's head. What does deception then constitute at its base level? A barrier to that, especially when in intimate relationships. I don't know what's in your head. This is something that's keeping me from being intimate with you. So we have this really strong, we all share this, a very strong compulsion to want to know when people are telling us the truth and wanting to know when people are lying to us. So from that flows an entire mythology about here's the magic pill, or here are all the magic cues that will show that. And anybody who wants to make money in the private sector off of deception is going to sell people on that. And it's no different than selling people on age-defying beauty creams, or I'll speak to your and my audience, hair increasing lotions, so this kind of stuff. It's just snake oil, but it has a deep and profound appeal. It goes to the root of I think in many ways a sense of intimacy and knowing others. And that's why deception is seen as such a form of betrayal, because it constitutes this concrete instance in which we're betraying somebody else.
I believe you just scratched on something that's called the McCornack-Parks Model, right?
Oh, yes. Do you want to talk a little bit about this? Oh, okay. So first off, let me just start with saying that Mac Parks and Mac was my mentor at the University of Washington when I was an undergraduate. We never called it that. So it was kind of interesting to see it arise and be called that. That label was given, to it by others. But what happened was, how much of the story you want to know? Because it's kind of an interesting story in terms of the background. So, I was a senior at the University of Washington as an undergraduate, and I was in the honors program there, so I had to do a senior honors thesis. And so I meet with Mac in his office, and he says, if you could find out anything you wanted to know about interpersonal communication, what would it be? I had previously been in a relationship with a woman who consistently lied to me about all things large and small, and I fell for it. Even though I felt really intimate toward her, it turns out she was just lying to me left and right, and I couldn't tell. And so I said to Mac, what I'd really like to find out is how I could have known her seemingly so well, been so in love with her, and yet she could lie to me and I couldn't tell. And so he, Mac is just brilliant, translated this into an empirical question, namely, what's the relationship between intimacy on the one hand and accuracy in detecting deception on the other? Or simply put, is love blind when it comes to deception? And so we started reading about that issue. And at that time, and this is ancient history, right? This is 1983. And so at that time, almost nobody, and actually nobody except Mark Comedina at Illinois State had done ever, in the entire world, had ever done any research looking at romantic couples and deception detection. So suddenly I became, and this goes back to your opening, I became a leading authority simply by default because nobody else had looked at this before, And so what we did, Mac's like, well, so what do you want to do? And my first idea was I would bring people into the lab and I would have them lie about how they felt about each other. And Mac's like, I don't think we can really do that. That's kind of unethical. And I was, a 21-year-old kid. I'm like, well, I thought it sounded kind of cool. So we're like, okay. So we decided what we do is we bring dating couples in and we would have them lie about their viewpoints on things like Machiavellianism and honesty and this kind of stuff, attitude stuff. So this is what we did. And then we looked at whether people could tell if their partners were lying to them. As we were thinking about this, it became clear to us that it wouldn't be a simple relationship just between how much in love and how familiar people were and how accurate they were. But instead, there were a couple other forces going on. One was the mediating force of how confident people were that they could tell when a partner is lying to them. So that is, the more in love with somebody I am and the more familiar I am with them, the more I also come to believe they would never lie to me, or rather, I could tell if they're lying to me. That's confidence. And then we also thought that what should arise at the same time is this belief that partner would never lie. And there was this footnote buried in, I think it was Zuckerman et al.'s meta-analysis in 1981 that mentioned that it may be the case that there is a bias on the part of recipients toward thinking that liars tell them the truth. And so I'd read that, and so Mac and I were talking about this, and we're like, how would we conceive of this? And so we said, well, it's really a truth bias. So we labeled this term just kind of sitting in his office, right? Side note, as you probably know, truth bias has gone on to become probably the most studied construct in deception detection history. It's one of the major factors that's now looked at and is really the foundation for Tim Levine's truth default theory ultimately. But Mac and I were just kind of tossing names around. What are we going to call this thing? Sitting in his office in 1983. So long story short, we do the study, and what we find out, in fact, is that as people become more intimate, yes, they begin to think that they can tell if a partner is lying to them. They also believe that the partner would never lie to them, and their accuracy goes down as a result. And so your average romantically involved couple is super intimate, really thinks that they could tell if partner's lying, really thinks their partner would never lie to them, and they actually can't tell at all when their partner does. That's the bottom line. McCornack-Parks Model.
A fascinating story. And I have a personal experience when it comes to the truth default theory, right? I mentioned it when I talked to Tim, but it was a very strong experience in that sense that I wrote my thesis at the very time I had your research papers and Tim's research papers all over the place, right?
Oh, wow.
I was in a management, that was last year. Yeah? I was in a management meeting, like 10, 12 managers on a big table. I was last entering the room, so I was at the head, and I was surprised by a story that was being told by my neighbor. Yeah, everything was extremely serious. The story itself was incredibly unbelievable. So unbelievable, I don't even dare to recall it here. Yeah, there was one catch though. Two of the other managers were in the game. So apparently they pulled this joke already on other meetings, right? But I did not question this. I questioned that story in terms of practicality, yeah? But I did not question the story in terms of can it be true at all, yeah? The moment the coin fell, I immediately had you and Tim in my mind. I immediately knew what happened. Truth default bias in myself,
Sure.
Yeah?
Sure.
But the strength, because I'm telling you, that was the most unbelievable story. If you hear it out of the context, it's really, I don't even dare to repeat it here. Yeah, but
well, go ahead.
This is not a kind of vague theory. Yeah, this is a strong system or a strong program that works in us if we want it or not. And even if the liar or the lie stares us in the face, and you would think, how in the world didn't I see that? That's the reason. Truth bias.
Yeah. So, and Tim may have talked about this with you previously, but Tim likes to frame it, and I agree totally. I think, Tim's right on the mark, that this is a very strategic behavioral adaptation, survival, evolutionary thing. It's also efficiency-wise. I mean, there's really two forces that drive us to operate from a truth default perspective. Efficiency-wise, we simply can't allocate cognitive resources day in and day out to questioning everything that somebody says. So, for example, I can't sit here in this moment questioning, are you really who you say you are? And is this really what you just told me just now? Did that really happen? I mean, we would just exhaust ourselves day in and day out, burning too much energy on trying to scrutinize everything. So for efficiency's sake, what we need to do is just kind of operate from this perspective that just kind of presumes truth unless otherwise demonstrated. I think also it has this, as Tim has often said, this evolutionary survival aspect to it, which is, and I've heard Tim talk about this so often and joke about it, but it's a great line. It's like, you think back to 100,000 years ago, if I'm standing, by my, cave or by my, it's a stereotype, but, by my encampment or whatever, and I see a shadow in my peripheral vision suddenly move. If I think that is a threat and I run, I live to, eat another day. But if I stop and go, I don't know whether that's really anything or not, then I get eaten. So there's a survival route, kind of evolutionary adaptive route to the idea that incoming sensory input through face, eyes, ears, eyes, nose, tongue, body is valid unless demonstrated otherwise. And there's cognitive science research which documents that human beings, we operate from this cognitive truth default with related incoming sensory input. What that means in terms of messaging is that every time we hear a message from somebody else or from the media, we don't interpret that message neutrally. We instead interpret it as true, then assess it potentially differently. And the only instances in which we'll assess it as potentially different, that is not true, is if in storing that message as true, it's inconsistent with other information we have in our head that we already know is true. What happens then is, in effect, a kind of cognitive error statement where so it goes into your long-term memory, settles in there, nested within the associated network of similar information. But if it's discordant with that information, then it spits back to conscious mind, and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound quite plausible. But those instances are fairly rare. When you add in the emotional aspect of it, I'm living with somebody and engaged to them or married to them or whatever. Now you've got a whole nother layer to a motivational layer to I don't want to know. And this is something that Mac and I and Tim and I have talked about over the years. And this is somewhat different than truth default, because this kind of goes to one of the potential motivations underlying a truth bias or a truth default within close relationships. This is not the cognitive bias. This is instead a motivational bias that compels me. I don't want to know. At an unconscious level and conscious level, I don't really want to know if my partner's lying to me.
There's a research paper, and maybe I heard you even talk about, I'm not entirely sure, yeah? The longer you're in a relationship, the higher is this motivation not to detect deception, right?
Oh, I'm sure.
Your investment in that relationship is already substantially higher than if you just met somebody a couple of weeks ago. Right? No, I just try to recall who did this. They did a research with actual couples under certain circumstances. Yeah. So biologically, evolutionary, it makes sense, right? The higher your investment, the higher your reluctance to do or find out anything that could jeopardize this relation.
Well, let me push this in a little different direction, because this opens the door on something which is related and I think undergirds so much of our concern with this, as I noted a moment ago. And this is the idea that we should know and or do know or are capable of knowing what's in other people's heads. So underlying the whole concern for deception and deception detection is this presumption that if deception doesn't exist, I then have unfiltered, unmediated access to what's in another person's head. And that's exceptionally important for intimate relationships. So if you ask 90% of people, what's the cornerstone of relational intimacy? They'll say understanding partners' thoughts, feelings, and having this connection so that you know what's going on in each other's heads. Well, a scholar in our field, which is actually one of my very favorite scholars, Alan Sillars, has looked at this issue and done a line of research looking at what he characterizes understanding. And understanding is the relationship between what you think and what I think you think. So, and simply put, am I a mind reader? Do I actually know what your beliefs are? And what Sillars argues is in close long-term relationships, we actually don't at all know what's in our partner's heads. Why? Well, there are obvious perceptual limitations for me getting inside your head. But more than anything else, the driving force is the overwhelming tendency to project our own views on others. So, if I'm with my wife and you ask me, Steve, what does Kelly think about this issue? I can close my eyes and call to mind vividly what I know she thinks. But what Sillars documents is that actually what's in my head, what I'm calling up, is not what she thinks at all. It's what I think. And then I take what I think and I project that onto her. Why? Because I presume that because we're so intimate, we believe the same things. So Sillars did this brilliant series of studies in which he brought married couples in. And on 10 issues, key issues of conflict within marriages, he had them describe their own feelings about the issue and then rate what their partners thought. Then he also, and here's the rub, did a whole bunch of measures looking at how happy these couples were. Okay? So now he's got some really cool data, right? He's got what each member of the relationship actually thinks, what each thinks the other one thinks, and whether or not they're happy. So what does he find? When he controls statistically for the projection effect, that is when he statistically controls for people's tendency to take their own beliefs as a reference and project them on the partner, the relationship between what people think their partner thinks and what their partners actually think is 0. These were long-term married couples. The average couple had been married 12 years. Their ability to actually know what their partner thought about 10 major sources of conflict in marriage was 0. Then he looks at happiness. Who were the happiest couples? Not the couple, because there's variance, okay? So the average is 0, but there's variance within the couples. The happiest couples were not the ones that were the most accurate. The happiest couples were the ones that were the least accurate, but scored highest on whether they thought they agreed, perceived similarity. So when you ask me, what's the key to romantic relationship, long-term romantic relationship bliss? My answer as a researcher is really thinking that you agree on things, but actually not knowing what's in your partner's head. And when you consider that and bring it full circle back to deception, deception is so important as an issue in relationships, especially discover deception, because again, it represents this barrier between what you're actually thinking and my access to that. But that in and of itself is mythological, because intimacy, despite our common folk belief that it's rooted in this mind meld between people in which we know each other's thoughts, feelings, isn't at all. That actually doesn't exist.
You're very much right. We are not only lousy in the deception detection, we humans, we are also not very successful in perceiving the emotional state of others and what they really think.
Absolutely. But it's important to think we can. And in couples, it's really important to think you know what each other are thinking and think that you agree. That's what drives happiness. It's illusory, but important.
And there's this desire and the illusion, you said it already, the illusion to think that we can, but also the desire that we want to be able to read other people, right? And this is where Paul Ekman Paul Ekman comes in with his 7 universal emotions and microexpressions. Right. I have to say, I have studied microexpressions. I'm certified by Paul Ekman. I'm familiar.
Oh, that's right.
I'm familiar with the action coding system, as facial action coding systems. I spent many hours in studying the 43 muscles in our face and the combinations for the various emotions, right? Before I found out that you can read incongruencies between what is said and what is felt sometimes, but again, it doesn't lend itself to deception detection. Also, they are not really, so they can be universal, but it's not so that every time you have this emotion, you show this configuration of specific muscle movements, right? So it's intuitively appealing, and it took me much too long, and I spent much too much time with it to realize that it's not bringing me there where I want, in terms of a tool, a usable tool. Right?
Well, there's another issue at play too, and it bears noting, for the record, it's just a matter of principle from my perspective. Ekman was critical in really kind of creating the whole field in the first place. I mean, he's really just a pioneer in detection work and has done incredible work on nonverbal stuff. I mean, he's kind of the founder of modern nonverbal coding and research. And so in a very real sense, I wouldn't have ever gotten interested in deception detection without, his work. He's really the pioneer in that domain. But to push it in a production direction for a moment, so we've been talking a lot about detection. Everything we've been saying to this point in our conversation is rooted in the idea the subtext presumption that people talk in truth versus lies. And our research, my research with Dr. Kelly Morrison, really clearly documents that too is a myth. People simply don't speak in conversation in bald-faced truths or bald-faced lies. So if you could ask me, for instance, like, what's the number one thing that I wish people would abandon within as a myth within deception, the field of deception, that it would be the bald-faced lie versus bald-faced truth dichotomy. So realize how all of these things are interconnected, because in order to presume that, quote, liars emit certain cues, I must presume first that there is such a thing as a lie message that's created. If you take that off the table, then the whole thing is a house of cards and the whole thing falls. And the fact of the matter is, yes, there are instances in which somebody will produce a brief message that's entirely false. You say, "Did you go bowling this morning?" And I say, "No, I went mountain climbing. And actually, I went to the store and did grocery shopping." True. Right? So, right? That's an entirely false message. But when you look at more elaborated messages as they occur in actual conversation and in response to actual prompts, people don't produce lies and truths. Instead, moment by moment, information bit by information bit, they're spinning information in all kinds of incredibly nuanced and complicated ways. And when you see that and you go through those data and you start thinking about the implications, what you realize is the entire idea of truth, of lie detection versus truth, is a big house of cards. And that's where Dr. Kelly Morrison and I are pretty much at right now, because we've done a number of studies now in which we have people generate messages in response to problematic situations without prompting them tell the truth or lie. We just let them produce whatever message they want to produce. And when they're in these situations with problematic information, people don't speak in truths or lies. Instead, people speak in these incredibly elaborate combinations of both.
You skipped ahead and went into the topic of verbal deception detection or verbal manipulation, which is my subject area. And of course, you're spot on. Yeah. So a very brief context, and I'm not here to talk about myself, but just to give you an idea. Yeah.
Sure, of course.
I'm coming into this due to my background through negotiations. I'm very much interested in negotiations. In negotiation, one thing is very clear. First of all, there's a lot of research, very good research. Second, absolutely true. People do not like to lie, at least not outright. For negotiators, it's much too risky. Yeah? They use more subtle means of manipulating information, which is where your information manipulation theory comes in, which was very interesting for me for my own academic research. Yeah? I had 30 senior executives participating in my research. I was giving them the freedom to decide what they want to do. Yeah, I knew the ground truth. They did what they did in their daily occupations. We used real business cases. So it was a role play, but the situation was about substance, right? It was a qualitative study, not a quantitative. So I didn't really count. Yeah, but my estimation is there were 3 to 5% outright lies. The rest were omissions and various forms of avoidance, right? Mm-hmm.
Sure.
And that's the absolutely interesting part, because the avoidance, you cannot see if someone is lying, but
right.
I can clearly see if somebody is avoiding something, right? Again, it doesn't say the person is lying. It just means as a negotiator, you come back, you circle back, or as an investigator even, you circle back to that point and gain more information. Yeah. So in regards to verbal deception detection, there's, I think, a little anecdote you might be able to elaborate on, because I know from an interview that I saw from you that you actually trained the NSA.
Well, okay. So Tim and Kelly and I and some other scholars who were all then at Michigan State, we initially landed a grant with the FBI to look at different agencies and try and hone their interrogation ability. the FBI ended up bailing on it, so we never worked with FBI agents, but we worked with the NSA interrogation team, and there's a very particular culture there within the interrogation team. Most of those folks are pretty young. I had kind of this law enforcement model, having worked with law enforcement behind kind of the gruff, tough interrogator. And most of these folks were kind of like 20-something super smart hipster types, It was just an interesting contrast. And for 6 months, they came to East Lansing at Michigan State and in our research lab there, and we worked with them. And we did a study in which it was a mock, it wasn't a mock, but it was a setup for a cheating on an experimental task. So the basic setup was the students come in and they're told that it's a project on teamwork. And so they're paired with another student and they have to solve a bunch of these difficult questions. Now, halfway through the task with the experimenter gets up and leaves the room. And then at that point, the one student who's actually an experimental confederate turns to the other and says, "Hey, I think they left the answers there. We should check them out." Those students who then conspire and check out the answers, when the experimenter comes back in, they do much better on the task. And the questions were really, really hard. They're like, the Earth's rotational orbit around the sun, this kind of stuff, people, these trivia questions that hardly anybody knew. So when they start getting the answers, correct, the pattern shifts, and then they get done. And there's big money at stake. We had, because it was a funded project, they started out with $100, and there are 10 questions, and we put the stack of $100 on the table in $10 bills, and for each one they get wrong, the experimenter would take one of the 10s away. So the students are, there's a motivation there to actually get the questions right. So afterwards, then we tell the student, for the ones who cheated, you did really great. We're going to talk to you a little bit about the strategies you employed. And so we move them to a different room and they sit down with another experimenter who asks them about the strategies they used to do so on the task. Well, unbeknownst to them, the experimenter in that room is actually a member of the NSA's interrogation team. So they're face to face with the NSA trained interrogator. And what we did was basically try and hone their skills in interrogating. And what we found was really, really interesting because they were really great to start out with. And what they demonstrated and what we helped them kind of fine tune is very much out of Tim's, kind of truth default theory and his arguments about cues. Because ultimately, Tim's conclusion coming out of his work is that you can detect deception if you listen really carefully to the content of what people are saying and check for inconsistencies and call them out on it. And what we learned was that the NSA interrogators aren't detecting deception per se in the way that we think of it. They're not scrutinizing people's behavior and saying, "Oh, you're looking down and to the left, you're lying." And the person goes, "Oh, you're right, you caught me." But instead, they were able to navigate the conversation to a place where the person is so cornered that they have to confess. So actually what the NSA interrogators were really good at is eliciting truthful confessions by just conversationally cornering people in inconsistencies they'd said to the point where they just said, "Forget it. Okay, you're right. I cheated." And so it was a really interesting exercise working these folks for 6 months. And what it showed me, and I think the important practical takeaway for all of your listeners is that trained interrogators can become very good deception detectors if they focus on or even, lay people can, if one focuses on the content of what is said and asking the right questions. But it's all conversational. It's all just kind of comparing consistencies and inconsistency with what you said, what to be the ground truth and kind of building it out that way and eventually just cornering the person in so they can go nowhere but having to confess.
Yeah, I brought it up because we're going in direction verbal deception detection. And I know that you not only have written 30 research papers about it, but, and this is how I came across you, you're the creator of the information manipulation theory, right? So if you can outline in its essence your information manipulation theory, and I think there are two versions. There's at least 1 and 2, right?
Right. There's the second one I creatively called 2. Okay. So in the original information manipulation theory, what happened was and this was for my dissertation originally, back in the late 1980s, I inadvertently, and it truly was inadvertent, I inadvertently used a different method than anybody had done prior to that. It wasn't some grand, brilliant thing. It was just like, I just kind of thought, oh, this would be kind of cool. And let's do this instead. But what it was is, instead of telling people to recall a lie or tell the truth or tell a lie, I put people in problematic contexts and just said, what would you say? So they're given no instructional prime other than just say what you would say if you were in the situation. And the problematical contexts were ones that I'd collected from a different sample. I'd ask them to write out in detail a situation in which you felt you had to lie to somebody. So they were lie triggering scenarios. So then I changed the names and put them in present tense, and I neutralized the gender, and then I gave it to a different sample of people and looked at what they said. Well, at the time, what I thought people were going to do is just kind of lie or tell the truth. Because at the time, I was very wedded to what I now call that binary truth-lie presumption. Instead, what I saw was almost infinite variability. That was very difficult to capture. So being the typical graduate student at the time, whenever you can't make sense of your data, the first thing you do is run to your advisor. So I ran to my advisor, Dr. Barbara O'Keefe at University of Illinois at the time. And I said, Barb, I can't make sense of these data, and she said, well, why don't you think multidimensionally? And so we started thinking about what's going on as people are playing with information along multiple dimensions. And in particular, Barb steered me toward the work of Paul Grice. And Paul Grice had talked about how people use language to convey information beyond what the words say. And he argues that undergirding that is a presumption in everyday conversation, which is guiding us right now, that in general, people are going to share as much information as is relevant, quantity. They're going to stay away from saying false things, quality. They're going to be clear and direct, manner. And they're going to be relevant, relation. And so people can exploit those by blatantly violating them in ways that trigger inferences, if I want to convey information beyond what the words say. Or I can exploit those, and that's a cooperative instance, if I want to convey kind of a message beyond the words to you. Or I can do that covertly. That is, you think I'm being informative, honest, relevant, and clear, but in fact, I'm secretly violating one of those. And when I saw that, based upon Barb's urging, it just seemed to click in my head. And I went back to my data, and it was a pretty good fit between what we saw. And what this all translates to is people have at least 4 primary ways they can play with information and conversation so as to mislead others. They can adjust how much information they tell somebody, given what information is relevant in their heads. They can adjust whether they include false information, just outright false information. They can play with how ambiguous or clear they make the information that they're sharing, or they can play with how relevant the information is that they're sharing. And people do all 4 all the time. But what people, as you rightly noted just a bit ago, what people overwhelmingly stay away from, if they can help it, is saying outright false stuff. Because Tim's work with Kim Sirota documents, and Tim and Kim did a bunch of work globally looking at the prolific liars and the distribution of who does lying. And what they find is that the vast majority of lies that are told in the world are told by an incredibly small number of people. It matches the same distribution of broader patterns of criminality, right? The vast majority of violent crime in the world is not distributed equally across the population, but instead is committed by a very small portion of human beings who like do all of the crime, and so when you look at that, where was I going with this? I just lost my place. I got caught up talking about criminality. So people can play with information all kinds of different ways, but they typically stay away from false stuff because that means we're lying. And what they do overwhelmingly, and you also noted this, a moment ago, is they tend to play with what Grice called quantity, if they can help it. That is, I'm just not going to tell you that information. I conceal it. I keep it back. I hide it. But instead of it being blatant and overt, which would trigger your suspicion, what they'll do is share a bunch of truthful information. They just won't tell you the critical piece. So let's say that, I go to a party last night, and at the party, a bunch of different things happen. You and I meet up and we chat for a bit, and then I see a couple of my other friends. And then halfway through the party, my ex comes up. I actually don't have an ex-wife, but let's say an ex-partner comes up and flirts with me for 5 minutes. Now it's the next day, and my wife says, "Oh, how was the party?" Well, I will then proceed to tell her, I saw you, and I saw, Tim, and I saw all these other people and everything. But what I just leave out is the 5 minutes of flirting with my ex. So it's a simple quantity violation. It's just a deletion of information. Now, to bring it back to what we talked about earlier, to bring this conversation full circle, there's no reason to suspect that that's going to be a cognitive load intensive experience. I'm just editing out. That's the kind of thing that we normally do. What's more, I'm not producing any made up false information. So it's not going to trigger arousal that's going to cause cues to, leak. Plus, there's no way for you to discern this unless you know the ground truth of what happened at the party. So this is what people opt for. They opt for overwhelmingly, and that's one of the principles of information manipulation theory too, is they overwhelmingly opt for quantity violations. That is, given the choice, people are just going to leave things out.
Yeah, that's what I saw in my own research. You were referring to Paul Grice's conversational maxims, quality, quantity, relation, and manner. I tried to analyze my data set via his maxims, and except for quality, quantity, relation, manner, you can spot it, but you cannot see if someone is lying. You just can't if you don't have ground truth. It's just not possible.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So, in regards to what can people really do, right? So there are circumstances, and they're not only criminal, but also in negotiations, high stakes negotiations, where it's crucial that you know if someone is telling the truth or not. I think it's even it goes even a bit further. When there is truth detection and there is deception detection, right? Both are equally important, I would say. We haven't mentioned yet, the general population is like flipping a coin, 55% deception detection accuracy. The same is true for most public servants. It doesn't matter if they are judges, if they are lawyers, but also police, investigators, etc., which makes it a bit hairy, right? But if we split this out into deception detection accuracy and truth detection accuracy, the balance gets even worse. Yeah. So professionals are often suffering from a lie bias, whilst the overall population suffers from a truth bias. Yeah, so it's an imbalance here, right?
Yes.
So coming back to my question, what could you, with your experience, what would you recommend in terms of either truth detection or deception detection for those where it really matters?
Well, I'm not, despite all we've talked about, I'm not really a detection guy. So I'm cautious about making any recommendations. I first of all would, and this might seem like kind of a dodge of your question. My honest recommendation to people, no pun intended, would be to read Tim's book on Duped.
You mean this one?
Yes. Basically, it says everything you could ever want to know about detecting deception and the nature of it. Or just give Tim a call and he'll talk your ear off about this. What I can say from personal experience is that it is possible, if, as we noted earlier, if one focuses upon which questions to ask and listens very carefully to the nature of answers, to kind of push a conversation to a point where somebody is, as it were, cornered, as it were, into having then to confess. And this is what, again, the NSA is really, really good at. They don't detect deception per se. And as a side note, which we didn't mention earlier, they wire people up to polygraph, right? In their interrogation sessions, people are just wired to the gills. But they are the first to admit that all the polygraph is used as is basically an intimidation tactic, right? Gets people thinking, through the mythology of polygraph that, we can tell when they're lying. And what they're really doing is they're not just completely eschewing behavior. They're looking for demeanor shifts. If somebody shows some kind of reactance to a question, they're not going to think the person's lying. They're not going to go, therefore they're lying, but they are going to go, that question caused reactance. I'm going to follow up on that and ask some more questions. So they're digging by watching and listening really acutely. In terms of the particulars of what questions to ask, or to how to go about doing that, I have to defer the answer to the question to Tim, because that's just not my domain of expertise. That's really Tim's. What I will say is what I often say to my students when we talk about this issue within outside of the professional realm, because Tim works a lot with law enforcement and stuff, and that's his domain, and I'm not an expert in that. What I will say, based upon the McCornack-Parks model and my own, earlier life and earlier career research on detection, is that I think it's, in many ways, relationally a fool's quest to concern oneself with trying to detect. It's a fool's quest because you can burn a lot of time and energy trying to tell if a romantic partner is lying to you, when likely all that you're going to end up deciding is an erroneous judgment. And so for that reason, my advice to my students when we talk about this issue is just to trust people until you're proven wrong. Even if you go into an encounter really suspicious, as you noted a moment ago, it's only likely to make you lie biased. It doesn't get you closer to the truth. And there's a lot of downsides to going through life with a suspicious, wary mindset. I'm not going to let anybody put one over on me. I'm not going to let anybody lie to me. Well, that's no way to live. You can't be happy as a person in that kind of context. So my recommendation to my students is trust people until you're proven wrong. And then when you're proven wrong and you find out about it, usually through indirect evidence, as Tim's work with Heesun Park and Kelly and I documented, people don't detect lies in the real world in relationships. They don't detect lies as they occur. They typically find out partners have lied to them through indirect means, like discovering incriminating messages on a phone or a computer, or having a friend come tell them. That's how lies are really detected in the real world. When that occurs, then you're at a decision point. Do I sustain this relationship or not? And that decision has to be made really carefully based upon a number of factors, including the nature of the lie, how important it was, and history of lying in the past, etc. I can't ever presume to tell people, you should end that relationship or not that one. I mean, that's people's judgment. But I do think it's a kind of a fool's quest to try and find out when people are lying to us in relationships. And within high-stakes professional domains, that's simply not my domain of expertise. If you want to get down in the weeds and talk about how do we actually do it, that's Tim's stuff. So check out Tim's book, Duped, everyone, if you're interested in that latter issue. Do a plug for my colleague.
Absolutely. The one, you know it yourself. You do a research project and you hope you really find something, right? In my case, yes, we found a lot of subtle means how people avoid giving information. But for me, and the most interesting, I can't even call it findings. The result, what I saw, was a very simple one. people do not listen. More than 90% of the deceivers in my research were successful simply because the recipient of the message did not listen. Yeah? And if I say successful, that means the receiver either stopped asking question or started to ask his or her own question, thus discontinuing the line of questioning that was going before. Yeah? So more than 90% of the deceivers were successful, simply because the vis-a-vis didn't listen. That was for me an eye-opener. I didn't expect the number to be so high, actually.
The degree to which we operate heuristically, using these simple decision rules is really astonishing. But it's also, if you go back to linguist George Zipf's principle of least effort, which I talk about in information manipulation theory too, this makes sense. Dr. Kelly Morrison and I were just talking about this the other day in our team taught class. We're only going to expend attentional resources very cautiously. We're very conservative. The most precious thing we all have is where we're going to put our attention. And we're loath to place attention on something if we don't think it's needed. And so much of our daily lives is spent diverting attention from what's being said at that moment to other tasks that we think are of much more salience, much more importance. And then we just operate on simple decision rules instead and just kind of passively process things. And that, of course, is the big story about deception detection and truth default, is that we're just not looking for it. We're not thinking about it. There's motivational forces for why we do that, and relational forces as well, and just efficiency, cognitive efficiency advantages that accrue from not trying to devote intense energy everywhere.
I think I heard you mention before evolutionary biology, I think, right? There is an evolutionary biologist, Robert Drivers. I don't know if you're familiar at all with him.
No, actually, I'm not.
Okay. Then we don't need to continue in this direction. However, there is a lady, a very smart and very modest lady called Dr. Isabel Picornell. I interviewed her also. Yes, I agree with you. It's very difficult to detect deception. However, she, as a forensic linguist, has made it her profession to do just that. And in this book that I just highlighted here, and in my interview with her, she mentioned and outlined in detail a case where, simply based on 15 emails that went between two participants, so 6 or 7 each, she prevented and detected $1 million fraud, right? And the way how she did it as forensic linguist is simply impressive, because she peeled one layer after the other of this potential fraud. So I was really impressed, because all she had were those emails. There was no prior knowledge, there was no baselining, there was no nothing, and she succeeded in doing so. And this is her profession. This is what she does. She is a professional when it comes to detecting deception via forensic linguistics. Right? So I don't know her success rate. I don't know. I know just she told me herself she loves what she does, which is why she said she should write more research papers, but because she loves so much what she does, she hasn't time to write more research papers. Right? So there is hope, right? When it comes to I'm reluctant to say deception detection, right? But to peeling the onion till you come to the truth, right?
Well, okay, so I haven't read her book, and so I can't comment particularly on her book. I will say that in written communication, text-based typewritten communication is different than spoken, very obviously. I think for spoken discourse, whenever somebody starts arguing that there are consistent linguistic indicators of deception, my immediate response is always, please identify the cognitive speech production basis for why that should be the case. So, for example, we know that messages are not produced as messages in toto inside the brain before they are produced as speech, but instead are streamed simultaneous to the production. So I'm speaking right now as I am producing, and these processes are occurring in parallel. And I'm building my utterance at this very moment as I talk to you, incrementally, one bit at a time. As I talk to you this moment, I don't even know how I'm going to end yet, 5 to 10 seconds from now. So if you're going to start arguing that, as some scholars have done, that certain pronominal usage or certain verb tense or whatever always indicates deception, my question for them is, please identify the speech production theory basis for why that should be the case, given that utterances, spoken utterances, are produced incrementally in parallel, and almost always what they do instead is basically argue kind of just generally based upon, more arousal would lead people to this, but they can never explain the specific modeling of why that should be the case from the cognitive mechanics that we now know guide speech production. So, for example, we know as a part of this parallel process in incremental speech production that the translation from lemmas, these cognitive conceptual ideas of words, to actual words and then syntax production occurs kind of late in the process. How is that then different? And why would it be different if what I'm doing is producing an incremental bit of falsehood versus an incremental bit of truth? Because again, to bring it full circle back to what we were talking about shortly ago, people don't produce bald-faced truths versus bald-faced lies. Instead, I produce an ongoing stream of discourse, bits of which might involve some falsehood, but more commonly, as you've rightly noted, complex spins of things, applying with shadings of this and that just occur momentarily, and then in the next little 4-word phrase will be perfectly clear again. So, to my knowledge, nobody who argues for linguistic cues of deception has yet explained how the speech production process is different. Like, what are the mechanics for what would make that different? Why would pronominal usage be different within this versus that, given what we now know about parallel processing, incremental discourse construction? And that's the big conundrum for me, which makes me, bottom line, extremely skeptical about any claims regarding linguistic differences of deception versus truth.
There are a number of professionals in the field. I don't know if you're aware, Mark McLitch, he's the creator of statement analysis. Then there's Avinoam Sapir, he created the scientific content analysis. I interviewed both. They are very much convinced about their methodologies. I also looked at the research, so I know it's ambiguous to say the least, right? But these are people who were a lifetime in the field, right?
Yep.
And they are so convinced that what they're doing and the techniques that they're working. And I have to say, both gentlemen are very modest gentlemen. They're not like salesmen, and they need to prove themselves. They're very
right, sure.
Yeah. So there is somehow a mismatch or a gap between academics and some of the professionals in the field. And I say consciously some, because there are a lot of professionals in the field that are just selling snake oil. Yeah, many of the books behind me are just snake oil. Right?
True. I think I don't have much to offer beyond what I said regarding it. I think that intensity of belief regarding one's rightness has a close to zero correlation with actual
I get it.
rightness.
I completely understand.
That being said, I also think that it's hopelessly conflated with the nature of the discourse being examined. So if within the research domain, and I can't comment much on the professional domain because I'm not familiar with much of the stuff that's going on in the private sector, lie detection industry. But within the research domain, much of what is studied is are your bald-faced lies. They're going to look at your real extreme case examples in which quite commonly participants were instructed to lie. And in a similar fashion within, police interrogations, for example, you've got a suspect in and he either stuffed all the steaks up his jacket or he didn't, before he left the grocery store. So you have kind of a ground truth knowledge, and then it's very much bifurcated into kind of binary truth lie in terms of what's going to be produced. And so is it possible that within those settings from a detection standpoint, there's certain consistent markers? Perhaps. Right? I would go back and say, I want to see the meta-analytic data supporting it. Show me study after study, these cues hold up across people, time, and situations. And then I would be very curious about the theoretical cognitive speech production processes at play.
I have only one last question, if I may.
Sure.
It has to do with Kelly Morrison, because in your emails and in our conversation, you mentioned her name a couple of times. What exactly is it that you're doing currently with Kelly Morrison? What type of research are you?
So what Kelly has developed, this is Dr. Kelly Morrison at University of Alabama, Birmingham. What she's developed is a unitizing scheme for parsing quote unquote messages into information bits. And this is, I think, other than the truth lie binary, which just drives me nuts because people don't speak in truths and lies in general. The other big thing that I'll frame it this way for you. I will retire a happy man if the field starts trending away from binary truth lie, and if people stop using their unit of analysis being the message. And there are a number of theoretical reasons to not code or think of discourse in terms of messages. Message is a construct that comes from mass media. There's a discrete unitary message that is constructed in advertising and then presented. But people don't produce or speak in messages. There's never a point in the cognitive process where you create an intact message that is unitary and then subsequently present it, in conversation at least. But the only time you actually present that ever is if actual speaking is interrupted. Like, you're asked a question and then you start going on it and somebody says, oh, hold on a sec, hold that thought kind of thing. And then the wheels will keep turning and you'll produce the message, so-called. So what Kelly has done is taken us away from thinking about discourse as messages, truth lie, but instead let's break up these messages into streams of information and unitize that. And when you look at the information units that people are playing with in their discourse streams, and you see the complexity of what people are doing moment by moment, you really just can't think of lies anymore. Like she and I talk about this all the time. It's like, we don't think lies exist. And that's half jokingly, because we know there are entirely false statements that somebody will say, but there's, as we talked about before, they're surprisingly rare. And when you look instead at how people incrementally construct discourse and bit by bit, the sophistication with what they're doing, moment by moment, word by word, it's just astonishing. And so that's the work that we're doing now, is we're looking at situations. We have several data sets we're going through. In fact, that's my research team meeting in a few minutes. We're going through these messages, quote unquote, that people produced in response to problematic situations, and we're parsing them up, unitizing them in terms of information bits, and then we're mapping the information flow across the course of the stream. bit by bit, and we're looking at what people do. And this is going to enable us to get at a number of things, including, but not limited to, the propensity of false information to be included in discourse streams. In our preliminary analysis in the one study across 120 people, we had, I think, 0.12 was the average proportion of false information within messages that were described as deceptive. So what it suggests overwhelmingly is that people aren't deceiving by saying false information. They're deceiving in other ways. So it's a really cool, exciting line of work to be working in right now, and it's really kind of shattered our, I was already thinking kind of about deception differently, but this has really shattered even the notion of people producing messages. People play with bits, and they play with bits in little incredibly innovative, surprising ways.
Steve McCornack, thank you so much for your time. I know I have overstayed my welcome by 20 minutes.
Oh, no. It's been great. It's been so enjoyable.
You're very generous. I cannot promise you that you will never hear from me again. Okay?
Well, I would hope you wouldn't promise that. It's been a delight both emailing with you and chatting with you today. So,
thank you. It was my pleasure having you, Steve.
All right. Take it easy.
Acquiring a new skill set takes time and dedication, and not everybody can do what it takes. But if you came this far, you're one of the few. Congratulations, you're ahead of the pack. And now, as promised in the introduction, an admittedly simplified version of a scientific test to verify your own assumptions in regards to your spouse's thoughts and feelings. Here are the 10+1 questions the scientists have used in the original study. You can make a screenshot or pause the video to note them down. For those who listen to this podcast by audio only, you can go to SaltCubeAnalytics.com, click on Men and Women in the menu bar, and scroll down till you find Join us for a little experiment. What you have to do seems at first glance simple enough. Take the 11 questions and, by yourself, rate the extent to which each topic is present in your relationship. In other words, how important is the issue for you, or how much does the issue bother you? Use these 5 response categories to guide you along. Very large extent, moderate extent, small extent, not at all. Next, do the same for your partner. How much do you think your partner thinks the conflict issues are presented in your relationship? Rate them exactly the same way. And lastly, convince your partner to rate the questions in the same way as just described, but also on his or her own. Now comes the challenging part, because in the next step, if both of you are courageous enough, you will compare your own ratings with the ratings of your partner. To help along the way, keep in mind that the happiest couples were not the ones that were most accurate. Actually, the happiest couples were the least accurate ones, but, and that's the important part, they scored the highest on whether they thought they agreed. To be more specific, the more you think that your partner thinks and feels the same about the given issue as you do, the happier you are in the relationship, independent of what your partner really thinks. To put this into Professor McCornack's words, the key to relationship bliss is thinking that you agree on things. And if you compare your own ratings with your partner's and you find yourself puzzled about the results, keep in mind that in general, people grossly overestimate the similarity between their own feelings and the feelings of their partners. This means your results are not an exception. Good luck. And that's it for today. Consider liking and subscribing if you appreciate the content. It costs you nothing and helps this channel. Thank you for watching.